Chapter 16. The question of a dwelling discussed again. Pencroff's ideas, an exploration to the north of the lake, the western boundary of the plateau, the serpents, the outlet of the lake, Top's alarm, Top swimming, a fight underwater, the dugong. It was the 6th of May, corresponding to the 6th of November in the northern hemisphere. For some days the sky had been cloudy, and it was important to make provision against winter. However, the temperature had not lessened much, and a centigrade thermometer transported to Lincoln Island would have averaged 10 degrees or 12 degrees above zero. This would not be surprising, since Lincoln Island, from its probable situation in the southern hemisphere, was subject to the same climatic influences as Greece or Sicily in the northern. But just as the intense cold in Greece and Sicily sometimes produces snow and ice, so, in the height of winter, this island would probably experience sudden changes in the temperature, against which it would be well to provide. At any rate, if the cold was not threatening, the rainy season was at hand, and upon this desolate island, in the wide Pacific, exposed to all the inclemency of the elements, the storms would be frequent, and, probably, terrible. The question of a more comfortable habitation than the Chimneys ought, therefore, to be seriously considered, and promptly acted upon. Pencroff, having discovered the Chimneys, naturally had a predilection for them, but he understood very well that another place must be found. This refuge had already been visited by the sea, and it would not do to expose themselves to a like accident. Moreover, added Smith, who was discussing these things with his companions, there are some precautions to take. Why? The island is not inhabited, said the reporter. Probably not, answered the engineer, although we have not yet explored the whole of it, but if there are no human beings, I believe dangerous beasts are numerous. So it will be better to provide a shelter against a possible attack, than for one of us to be tending the fire every night. And then, my friends, we must foresee everything. We are here in a part of the Pacific often frequented by Malay pirates. What, at this distance from land? Exclaimed Herbert. Yes, my boy, these pirates are hardy sailors as well as formidable villains, and we must provide for them accordingly. Well, said Pencroff, we will fortify ourselves against 2- and 4-footed savages. But, sir, wouldn't it be as well to explore the island thoroughly before doing anything else? It would be better, added Spilett. Who knows but we may find on the opposite coast one or more of those caves which we have looked for here in vain. Very true, answered the engineer, but you forget, my friends, that we must be somewhere near running water, and that from Mount Franklin we were unable to see either brook or river in that direction. Here, on the contrary, we are between the Mercy and Lake Grant, which is an advantage not to be neglected. And, moreover, as this coast faces the east, it is not as exposed to the trade winds, which blow from the northwest in this hemisphere. Well, then, Mr. Smith, replied the sailor, let us build a house on the edge of the lake. We are no longer without bricks and tools. After having been brickmakers, potters, founders, and smiths, we ought to be masons easily enough. Yes, my friend, but before deciding it will be well to look about. A habitation already made would save us a great deal of work, and would, doubtless, offer a surer retreat, in which we would be safe from enemies, native as well as foreign. But, Cyrus, answered the reporter, have we not already examined the whole of this great granite wall without finding even a hole? No, not one. Added Pencroff. If we could only dig a place in it high out of reach, that would be the thing. I can see it now, on the part overlooking the sea, 5 or 6 chambers. With windows, said Herbert, laughing. And a staircase, added Neb. Why do you laugh? Cried the sailor. Haven't we picks and mattocks? Cannot Mr. Smith make powder to blow up the mine? You will be able, won't you, sir, to make powder when we want it? The engineer had listened to the enthusiastic sailor developing these imaginative projects. To attack this mass of granite, even by mining, was an Herculean task, and it was truly vexing that nature had not helped them in their necessity. But he answered Pencroff, by simply proposing to examine the wall more attentively, from the mouth of the river to the angle which ended it to the north. They therefore went out and examined it most carefully for about 2 miles. but everywhere it rose, uniform and upright, without any visible cavity. The rock pigeons flying about its summit had their nests in holes drilled in the very crest, or upon the irregularly cut edge of the granite. To attempt to make a sufficient excavation in such a massive wall even with pickaxe and powder was not to be thought of. It was vexatious enough. By chance, Pencroff had discovered in the chimneys, which must now be abandoned, the only temporary, habitable shelter on this part of the coast. When the survey was ended, the colonists found themselves at the northern angle of the wall, where it sunk by long declivities to the shore. From this point to its western extremity it was nothing more than a sort of talus composed of stones, earth, and sand bound together by plants, shrubs, and grass, in a slope of about 45 degrees. Here and there the granite thrust its sharp points out from the cliff. Groups of trees grew over these slopes and there was a thin carpet of grass. But the vegetation extended but a short distance, and then the long stretch of sand, beginning at the foot of the talus, merged into the beach. Smith naturally thought that the overflow of the lake fell in this direction, as the excess of water from Red Creek must be discharged somewhere, and this point had not been found less on the side already explored, that is to say from the mouth of the creek westward as far as Prospect Plateau. The engineer proposed to his companions that they clamber up the talus and return to the chimneys by the heights, exploring the eastern and western shores of the lake. The proposition was accepted, and, in a few minutes, Herbert and Neb had climbed to the plateau, the others following more leisurely. 200 feet distant the beautiful sheet of water shone through the leaves in the sunlight. The landscape was charming. The trees in autumn tints were harmoniously grouped. Some huge old weather-beaten trunks stood out in sharp relief against the green turf which covered the ground, and brilliant cockatoos, like moving prisms, glanced among the branches, uttering their shrill screams. The colonists, instead of proceeding directly to the north bank of the lake, bore along the edge of the plateau, so as to come back to the mouth of the creek, on its left bank. It was a circuit of about a mile and a half. The walk was easy, as the trees, set wide apart, left free passage between them. They could see that the fertile zone stopped at this point, and that the vegetation here was less vigorous than anywhere between the creek and the Mersey. Smith and his companions moved cautiously over this unexplored neighborhood. Bows and arrows and iron-pointed sticks were their sole weapons. But no beast showed itself, and it was probable that the animals kept to the thicker forests in the south. The colonists, however, experienced a disagreeable sensation in seeing Top stop before a huge serpent 14 or 15 feet long. Neb killed it at a blow. Smith examined the reptile, and pronounced it to belong to the species of diamond serpents eaten by the natives of New South Wales and not venomous, but it was possible others existed whose bite was mortal, such as the forked-tailed death viper, which rise up under the foot, or the winged serpents, furnished with two ear-like appendages, which enable them to shoot forward with extreme rapidity. Top, having gotten over his surprise, pursued these reptiles with reckless fierceness, and his master was constantly obliged to call him in. The mouth of Red Creek, where it emptied into the lake, was soon reached. The party recognized on the opposite bank the point visited on their descent from Mount Franklin. Smith ascertained that the supply of water from the creek was considerable, there therefore must be an outlet for the overflow somewhere. It was this place which must be found, as, doubtless, it made a fall which could be utilized as a motive power. The colonists, strolling along, without, however, straying too far from each other, began to follow round the bank of the lake, which was very abrupt. The water was full of fishes, and Pencroff promised himself soon to manufacture some apparatus with which to capture them. It was necessary first to double the point at the northeast. They had thought that the discharge would be here, as the water flowed close to the edge of the plateau. But as it was not here, the colonists continued along the bank, which, after a slight curve, followed parallel with the seashore. On this side the bank was less wooded, but clumps of trees, here and there, made a picturesque landscape. The whole extent of the lake, unmoved by a single ripple, was visible before them. Top, beating the bush, flushed many coveys of birds, which Spilett and Herbert saluted with their arrows. One of these birds, cleverly hit by the lad, dropped in the rushes. Top, rushing after it, brought back a beautiful slate-colored waterfowl. It was a coot, as large as a big partridge, belonging to the group of Muschiodactyls, which form the division between the waders and the palmipids. Poor game and bad tasting, but as Top was not as difficult to please as his masters, it was agreed that the bird would answer for his supper. Then the colonists, following the southern bank of the lake, soon came to the place they had previously visited. The engineer was very much surprised, as he had seen no indication of an outlet to the surplus water. In talking with the reporter and the sailor, he did not conceal his astonishment. At this moment, Top, who had been behaving himself quietly, showed signs of alarm. The intelligent animal, running along the bank, suddenly stopped, with one foot raised, and looked into the water as if pointing some invisible game. Then he barked furiously, questioning it, as it were, and again was suddenly silent. At first neither Smith nor his companions paid any attention to the dog's actions, but his barking became so incessant, that the engineer noticed it. "What is it, Top?" he called. The dog bounded towards his master, and, showing a real anxiety, rushed back to the bank. Then, suddenly, he threw himself into the lake. "Come back here," Top cried the engineer, not wishing his dog to venture in those suspicious waters. "What's going on under there?" asked the sailor, examining the surface of the lake. "Top has smelled something amphibious," answered Herbert. "It must be an alligator," said the reporter. "I don't think so," answered Smith. "Alligators are not met with in this latitude." Meantime, Top came ashore at the call of his master, but he could not be quiet. He rushed along the bank, through the tall grass, and, guided by instinct, seemed to be following some object, invisible under the water, which was hugging the shore. Nevertheless, the surface was calm and undisturbed by a ripple. Often the colonists stood still on the bank and watched the water, but they could discover nothing. There certainly was some mystery here, and the engineer was much perplexed. "We will follow out this exploration," he said. In half an hour all had arrived at the southeast angle of the lake, and were again upon Prospect Plateau. They had made the circle of the bank without the engineer having discovered either where or how the surplus water was discharged. "Nevertheless, this outlet exists," he repeated, "and, since it is not outside, it must penetrate the massive granite of the coast." "And why do you want to find that out?" asked Spilett. "Because," answered the engineer, "if the outlet is through the solid rock, it is possible that there is some cavity, which could be easily rendered habitable, after having turned the water in another direction." "But may not the water flow into the sea, through a subterranean outlet at the bottom of the lake?" asked Herbert. "Perhaps so," answered Smith, "and in that case, since nature has not aided us, we must build our house ourselves." As it was 5 o'clock, the colonists were thinking of returning to the chimneys across the plateau, when Top again became excited, and, barking with rage, before his master could hold him, he sprang a second time into the lake. Everyone ran to the bank. The dog was already 20 feet off, and Smith called to him to come back, when suddenly an enormous head emerged from the water. Herbert instantly recognized it, the comical face, with huge eyes and long silky mustaches. "A manatee," he cried. Although not a manatee, it was a dugong, which belongs to the same species. The huge monster threw himself upon the dog. His master could do nothing to save him, and, before Spilett or Herbert could draw their bows, Top, seized by the dugong, had disappeared under the water. Neb, spear in hand, would have sprung to the rescue of the dog, and attacked the formidable monster in its own element, had he not been held back by his master. Meanwhile a struggle was going on under the water, a struggle which, owing to the powerlessness of the dog, was inexplicable, a struggle which, they could see by the agitation of the surface, was becoming more terrible each moment, in short, a struggle which could only be terminated by the death of the dog. But suddenly, through the midst of a circle of foam, Top appeared, shot upward by some unknown force, rising 10 feet in the air, and falling again into the tumultuous waters, from which he escaped to shore without any serious wounds, miraculously saved. Cyrus Smith and his companions looked on amazed. Still more inexplicable, it seemed as if the struggle under water continued. Doubtless the dugong, after having seized the dog, had been attacked by some more formidable animal, and had been obliged to defend itself. But this did not last much longer. The water grew red with blood, and the body of the dugong, emerging from the waves, floated onto a little shoal at the southern angle of the lake. The colonists ran to where the animal lay, and found it dead. Its body was enormous, measuring between 15 and 16 feet long and weighing between 3,000 and 4,000 pounds. On its neck, yawned a wound, which seemed to have been made by some sharp instrument. What was it that had been able, by this terrible cut, to kill the formidable dugong? None of them could imagine, and, preoccupied with these incidents, they returned to the Chimneys. Chapter 17. A visit to the lake, the direction of the current, the prospects of Cyrus Smith, the dugong fat, the use of the cistus limestone, the sulfate of iron, how glycerin is made, soap, saltpetre, sulfuric acid, nitric acid, the new outlet. The next day, the 7th of May, Smith and Spilett, leaving NEB to prepare the breakfast, climbed the plateau, while Herbert and Pencroff went after a fresh supply of wood. The engineer and the reporter soon arrived, at the little beach where the dugong lay stranded. Already flocks of birds had gathered about the carcass, and it was necessary to drive them off with stones, as the engineer wished to preserve the fat for the use of the colony. As to the flesh of the dugong, it would undoubtedly furnish excellent food, as in certain portions of the Malay archipelago it is reserved for the table of the native princes. But it was NEB's affair to look after that. Just now, Cyrus Smith was thinking of other things. The incident of the day before was constantly presenting itself. He wanted to solve the mystery of that unseen combat, and to know what congener of the mastodons or other marine monster had given the dugong this strange wound. He stood upon the border of the lake, looking upon its tranquil surface sparkling under the rays of the rising sun. From the little beach where the dugong lay, the waters deepened slowly towards the center, and the lake might be likened to a large basin, filled by the supply from Red Creek. "Well," Cyrus questioned the reporter, "I don't see anything suspicious in this." "No, my dear fellow, and I am at a loss how to explain yesterday's affair. The wound on this beast is strange enough, and I can't understand how Top could have been thrown out of the water in that way. One would suppose that it had been done by a strong arm, and that that same arm, wielding a poignard, had given the dugong his death wound. It would seem so," answered the engineer, who had become thoughtful. "There is something here which I cannot understand. But neither can we explain how I myself was saved, how I was snatched from the waves and borne to the downs. Therefore, I am sure there is some mystery which we will some day discover. In the meantime, let us take care not to discuss these singular incidents before our companions, but keep our thoughts for each other, and continue our work." It will be remembered that Smith had not yet discovered what became of the surplus water of the lake, and as there was no indication of its ever overflowing, an outlet must exist somewhere. He was surprised, therefore, on noticing a slight current just at this place. Throwing in some leaves and bits of wood, and observing their drift, he followed this current, which brought him to the southern end of the lake. Here he detected a slight depression in the waters, as if they were suddenly lost in some opening below. Smith listened, placing his ear to the surface of the lake, and distinctly heard the sound of a subterranean fall. "It is there," said he, rising, "there that the water is discharged, there, doubtless, through a passage in the massive granite that it goes to join the sea, through cavities which we will be able to utilize to our profit. Well, I will find out." The engineer cut a long branch, stripped off its leaves, and, plunging it down at the angle of the two banks, he found that there was a large open hole a foot below the surface. This was the long sought for outlet, and such was the force of the current that the branch was snatched from his hands and disappeared. "There can be no doubt of it now," repeated the engineer. "It is the mouth of the outlet, and I am going to work to uncover it." "How?" inquired Spilett. "By lowering the lake 3 feet." "And how will you do that?" "By opening another vent larger than this." "Whereabouts, Cyrus?" "Where the bank is nearest the coast." "But it is a granite wall," exclaimed Spilett. "Very well," replied Smith. "I will blow up the wall, and the waters, escaping, will subside so as to discover the orifice." "And will make a waterfall at the cliff," added the reporter. "A fall that we will make use of," answered Cyrus. "Come, come." The engineer hurried off his companion, whose confidence in Smith was such that he doubted not the success of the undertaking. And yet, this wall of granite, how would they begin? How, without powder, with but imperfect tools, could they blast the rock? Had not the engineer undertaken a work beyond his skill to accomplish? When Smith and the reporter re-entered the Chimneys, they found Herbert and Pencroff occupied in unloading their raft. "The wood choppers have finished, sir," said the sailor, laughing, "and when you want masons—" "Not masons, but chemists," interrupted the engineer. "Yes," added Spilett, "we are going to blow up the island." "Blow up the island?" cried the sailor. "A part of it, at least," answered the reporter. "Listen to me, my friends," said the engineer, who thereupon made known the result of his observations. His theory was, that a cavity, more or less considerable, existed in the mass of granite which upheld Prospect Plateau, and he undertook to penetrate to it. To do this, it was first necessary to free the present opening, in other words to lower the level of the lake by giving the water a larger issue. To do this they must manufacture an explosive with which to make a drain in another part of the bank. It was this Smith was going to attempt to do, with the minerals nature had placed at his disposal. All entered into the proposal with enthusiasm. Neb and Pencroff were at once detailed to extract the fat from the dugong and to preserve the flesh for food, and soon after their departure the others, carrying the hurdle, went up the shore to the vein of coal, where were to be found the sister spirits of which Smith had procured a specimen. The whole day was employed in bringing a quantity of these pyrits to the Chimneys, and by evening they had several tons. On the next day, the 8th of May, the engineer began his manipulations. The sister spirits were principally composed of carbon, of silica, of alumina, and sulfurate of iron. These were in excess. It was necessary to separate the sulfurate and change it into sulfate by the quickest means. The sulfate obtained, they would extract the sulfuric acid, which was what they wanted. Sulfuric acid is one of the agents in most general use, and the industrial importance of a nation can be measured by its consumption. In the future this acid would be of use to the colonists in making candles, tanning skins, etc., but at present the engineer reserved it for another purpose. Smith chose, behind the Chimneys, a place upon which the earth was carefully leveled. On this he made a pile of branches and cut wood, on which were placed pieces of sister spirits leaning against each other, and then all was covered over with a thin layer of pyrits previously reduced to the size of nuts. This done, they set the wood on fire, which in turn inflamed the cyst, as it contained carbon and sulfur. Then new layers of pyrits were arranged so as to form an immense heap, surrounded with earth and grass, with their holes left here and there, just as is done in reducing a pile of wood to charcoal. Then they left the transformation to complete itself. It would take 10 or 12 days for the sulfurate of iron and the alumina to change into sulfates, which substances were equally soluble. The others, silica, burnt carbon, and cinders, were not so. While this chemical process was accomplishing itself, Smith employed his companions upon other branches of the work, which they undertook with the utmost zeal. Neb and Pencroff had taken the fat from the dugong, which had been placed in large earthen jars. It was necessary to separate the glycerin from this fat by saponifying it. It was sufficient, in order to do this, to treat it with chalk or soda. Chalk was not wanting, but by this treatment the soap would be calcareous and useless, while by using soda, a soluble soap, which could be employed for domestic purposes, would be the result. Cyrus Smith, being a practical man, preferred to try to get the soda. Was this difficult? No, since many kinds of marine plants abounded on the shore, and all those fucaceae which form wrack. They therefore gathered a great quantity of these seaweed, which were first dried, and, afterwards, burnt in trenches in the open air. The combustion of these plants was continued for many days, so that the heat penetrated throughout, and the result was the greyish compact mass, long known as natural soda. This accomplished, the engineer treated the fat with the soda, which gave both a soluble soap and the neutral substance, glycerin. But this was not all. Smith wanted, in view of his future operations, another substance, nitrate of potash, better known as saltpetre. He could make this by treating carbonate of potash, which is easily extracted from vegetable ashes, with nitric acid. But this acid, which was precisely what he wanted in order to complete his undertaking successfully, he did not have. Fortunately, in this emergency, nature furnished him with saltpeter, without any labor other than picking it up. Herbert had found a vein of this mineral at the foot of Mount Franklin, and all they had to do was to purify the salt. These different undertakings, which occupied 8 days, were finished before the sulfate of iron was ready. During the interval the colonists made some refractory pottery in plastic clay, and constructed a brick furnace of a peculiar shape, in which to distill the sulfate of iron. All was finished on the 18th of May, the very day the chemical work was completed. The result of this latter operation, consisting of sulfate of iron, sulfate of alumina, silica, and a residue of charcoal and cinders, was placed in a basin full of water. Having stirred up the mixture, they let it settle, and at length poured off a clear liquid holding the sulfates of iron and alumina in solution. Finally, this liquid was partly evaporated, the sulfate of iron crystallized, and the mother water was thrown away. Smith had now a quantity of crystals, from which the sulfuric acid was to be extracted. In commerce this acid is manufactured in large quantities and by elaborate processes. The engineer had no such means at his command, but he knew that in Bohemia an acid known as nordozen is made by simpler means, which has, moreover, the advantage of being non-concentrated. For obtaining the acid in this way, all the engineer had to do was to calcinize the crystals in a closed jar in such a manner that the sulfuric acid distilled in vapor, which would in turn produce the acid by condensation. It was for this that the refractory jars and the furnace had been made. The operation was a success, and on the 20th of May, 12 days after having begun, Smith was the possessor of the agent which he expected to use later in different ways. What did he want with it now? Simply to produce nitric acid, which was perfectly easy, since the saltpeter, attacked by the sulfuric acid, would give it by distillation. But how would he use this acid? None of the others knew, as he had spoken no word on the subject. The work approached completion, and one more operation would procure the substance which had required all this labor. The engineer mixed the nitric acid with the glycerin, which latter had been previously concentrated by evaporation in a water bath, and without employing any freezing mixture, obtained many pints of an oily yellow liquid. This last operation Smith had conducted alone, at some distance from the chimneys, as he feared an explosion, and when he returned, with a flagon of this liquid, to his friends, he simply said, "Here is some nitroglycerin." It was, in truth, that terrible product, whose explosive power is, perhaps, 10 times as great as that of gunpowder, and which has caused so many accidents. Although, since means have been found of transforming it into dynamite, that is, of mixing it with clay or sugar or some solid substance sufficiently porous to hold it, the dangerous liquid can be used with more safety. But dynamite was not known when the colonists were at work on Lincoln Island. "And is that stuff going to blow up the rocks?" asked Pencroff, incredulously. "Yes, my friend," answered the engineer, "and it will do all the better since the granite is very hard and will oppose more resistance to the explosion." "And when will we see all this, sir?" "Tomorrow when we have drilled a hole," answered the engineer. Early the next morning, the 21st of May, the miners betook themselves to a point which formed the east bank of Lake Grant, not more than 500 feet from the coast. At this place the plateau was lower than the lake, which was upheld by the coping of granite. It was plain that could they break this the waters would escape by this vent, and, forming a stream, flow over the inclined surface of the plateau, and be precipitated in a waterfall over the cliff onto the shore. Consequently, there would be a general lowering of the lake, and the orifice of the water would be uncovered. This was to be the result. The coping must be broken. Pencroff, directed by the engineer, attacked its outer facing vigorously. The hole which he made with his pick began under a horizontal edge of the bank, and penetrated obliquely so as to reach a level lower than the lake's surface. Thus the blowing up of the rocks would permit the water to escape freely and consequently lower the lake sufficiently. The work was tedious, as the engineer, wishing to produce a violent shock, had determined to use not less than 2 gallons of nitroglycerin in the operation. But Pencroff and Neb, taking turns at the work, did so well, that by 4 o'clock in the afternoon it was achieved. Now came the question of igniting the explosive. Ordinarily, nitroglycerin is ignited by the explosion of fulminated caps, as, if lighted without percussion, this substance burns and does not explode. Smith could doubtless make a cap. Lacking fulminate, he could easily obtain a substance analogous to gun cotton, since he had nitric acid at hand. This substance pressed in a cartridge, and introduced into the nitroglycerin, could be lighted with a slow match, and produce the explosion. But Smith knew that their liquid had the property of exploding under a blow. He determined, therefore, to make use of this property, reserving the other means in case this experiment failed. The blow of a hammer upon some drops of the substance spread on a hard stone, suffices to provoke an explosion. But no one could give those blows without being a victim to the operation. Smith's idea was to suspend a heavy mass of iron by means of a vegetable fiber to an upright post, so as to have the iron hang directly over the hole. Another long fiber, previously soaked in sulfur, was to be fastened to the middle of the first and laid along the ground many feet from this excavation. The fire was to be applied to this second fiber, it would burn till it reached the first and set it on fire, then the latter would break and the iron be precipitated upon the nitroglycerin. The apparatus was fixed in place, then the engineer, after having made his companions go away, filled the hole so that the fluid overflowed the opening, and spread some drops underneath the mass of suspended iron. This done, Smith lit the end of the sulfured fiber, and, leaving the place, returned with his companions to the chimneys. 25 minutes after a tremendous explosion was heard. It seemed as if the whole island trembled to its base. A volley of stones rose into the air as if they had been vomited from a volcano. The concussion was such that it shook the chimneys. The colonists, though 2 miles away, were thrown to the ground. Rising again, they clambered up to the plateau and hurried towards the place. A large opening had been torn in the granite coping. A rapid stream of water escaped through it, leaping and foaming across the plateau, and, reaching the brink, fell a distance of 300 feet to the shore below. Chapter 18. Pencroff doubts no more, the old outlet of the lake. A subterranean descent, the way through the granite. Top has disappeared, the central cavern, the lower. Well, mystery, the blows with the pick, the return. Smith's project had succeeded, but, as was his manner, he stood motionless, absorbed, his lips closed, giving no sign of satisfaction. Herbert was all enthusiasm, Neb jumped with joy, Pencroff, shaking his head, murmured. Indeed, our engineer does wonders. The nitroglycerin had worked powerfully. The opening was so great that at least a 3 times greater volume of water escaped by it than by the former outlet. In a little while, therefore, the level of the lake would be lowered 2 feet or more. The colonists returned to the chimneys, and collecting some picks, spears, ropes, a steel and tinder, returned to the plateau. Top went with them. On the way the sailor could not resist saying to the engineer, "But do you really think, Mr. Smith, that one could blow up the whole island with this beautiful liquid of yours?" "Doubtless," replied the other, "island, continents, the world itself. It is only a question of quantity. Couldn't you use this nitroglycerin to load firearms?" "No, Pencroff, because it is too shattering. But it would be easy to make gun cotton, or even common powder, as we have the material. Unfortunately, the guns themselves are wanting. But with a little ingenuity." Pencroff had erased impossible from his vocabulary. The colonists, having reached Prospect Plateau, hastened at once to the old outlet of the lake, which ought now to be uncovered. And when the water no longer poured through it, it would, doubtless, be easy to explore its interior arrangement. In a few moments they reached the lower angle of the lake, and saw at a glance what the result was. There, in the granite wall of the lake, above the water level, appeared the long-looked-for opening. A narrow ledge, left bare, by the subsidence of the water, gave them access to it. The opening was 20 feet wide, though only 2 feet high. It was like the gutter mouth in a pavement. It was not open enough for the party to get in, but Neb and Pencroff, with their picks, in less than an hour had given it a sufficient height. The engineer looked in and saw that the walls of the opening in its upper part showed a slope of from 30 degrees to 35 degrees. And, therefore, unless they became much steeper it would be easy to descend, perhaps, to the level of the sea. And if, as was probable, some vast cavern existed in the interior of the massive granite, it was possible that they could make use of it. "What are we waiting for, Mr. Smith?" cried the sailor, all impatience to begin the exploration. "Top, you see, has gone ahead." "We must have some light," said the engineer. "Go, Neb, and cut some resinous branches." The Negro and Herbert ran to some pine and evergreens growing upon the bank, and soon returned with branches which were made into torches. Having lit them, the colonists, with Smith leading, entered the dark passage, but recently filled with water. Contrary to their expectation, the passage grew higher as they advanced, until soon they were able to walk upright. The granite walls, worn by the water, were very slippery, and the party had to look out for falls. They, therefore, fastened themselves together with a cord, like mountain climbers. Fortunately, some granite steps made the descent less perilous. Drops of water, still clinging to the rocks, glistened like stalactites in the torchlight. The engineer looked carefully at this black granite. He could not see a stratum or a flaw. The mass was compact and of fine grain, and the passage must have been coeval with the island. It had not been worn little by the constant action of water. Pluto, and not Neptune, had shaped it, and the traces of igneous action were still visible upon its surface. The colonists descended but slowly. They experienced some emotion in thus adventuring into the depths of the earth, in being its first human visitants. No one spoke, but each was busied with his own reflections, and the thought occurred to more than one, that perhaps some pulp or other gigantic cephalopod might inhabit the interior cavities which communicated with the sea. It was, therefore, necessary to advance cautiously. Top was ahead of the little troop, and they could rely on the dog's sagacity to give the alarm on occasion. After having descended 100 feet, Smith halted, and the others came up with him. They were standing in a cavern of moderate size. Drops of water fell from the roof, but they did not ooze through the rocks. They were simply the last traces of the torrent which had so long roared through this place, and the air, though humid, emitted no mephitic vapor. "Well, Cyrus," said Spilett, "here is a retreat sufficiently unknown and hidden in the depths, but it is uninhabitable." "How, uninhabitable?" asked the sailor. "Why, it is too small and too dark." "Cannot we make it bigger, blast it out, and make openings for the light and air?" answered Pencroff, who now thought nothing impracticable. "Let us push on," said Smith. "Perhaps lower down, nature will have spared us this work." "We are only a third of the way down," observed Herbert. "But 100 feet," responded Cyrus, "and it is possible that 100 feet lower, "Where is Top?" asked Neb, interrupting his master. They looked about the cavern. The dog was not there. "Let us overtake him," said Smith, resuming the march. The engineer noted carefully all the deviations of the route, and easily kept a general idea of their direction, which was towards the sea. The party had not descended more than 50 feet further, when their attention was arrested by distant sounds coming from the depths of the rock. They stopped and listened. These sounds, borne along the passage, as the voice through an acoustic tube, were distinctly heard. "It's Top's barking!" cried Herbert. "Yes, and the brave dog is barking furiously," added Pencroff. "We have our spears," said Smith. "Come on, and be ready." "It is becoming more and more interesting," whispered Spilett to the sailor, who nodded assent. They hurried to the rescue of the dog. His barks grew more distinct. They could hear that he was in a strange rage. Had he been captured by some animal whom he had disturbed? Without thinking of the danger, the colonists felt themselves drawn on by an irresistible curiosity, and slipped rather than ran down the passage. 16 feet lower they came up with the dog. There, the corridor opened out into a vast and magnificent cavern. Top, rushing about, was barking furiously. Pencroff and Neb, shaking their torches, lit up all the inequalities of the granite, and the others, with their spears ready, held themselves prepared for any emergency. But the enormous cavern was empty. The colonists searched everywhere, they could find no living thing. Nevertheless, Top continued barking, and neither threats nor caresses could stop him. "There must be some place where the water escaped to the sea," said the engineer. "Yes, and look out for a hole," answered Pencroff. "On, Top, on," cried Smith, and the dog, encouraged by his master, ran towards the end of the cavern, and redoubled his barking. Following him, they saw by the light of the torches the opening of what looked like a well in the granite. Here, undoubtedly, was the place where the water had found its way out of the cavern, but this time, instead of being a corridor sloping and accessible, it was a perpendicular well, impossible to descend. The torches were waved above the opening. They saw nothing. Smith broke off a burning branch and dropped it into the abyss. The resin, fanned by the wind of its fall, burned brightly and illuminated the interior of the pit, but showed nothing else. Then the flame was extinguished with a slight hiss, which indicated that it had reached the water, which must be the sea level. The engineer calculated, from the time taken in the fall, that the depth was about 90 feet. The floor of the cavern was therefore that distance above the sea. "Here is our house," said Smith. "But it was preoccupied," said Spilett, whose curiosity was unsatisfied. "Well, the thing that had it, whether amphibious or not, has fled by this outlet and vacated in our favor," replied the engineer. "Anyhow, I should like to have been top a quarter of an hour ago," said the sailor, "for he does not bark at nothing." Smith looked at his dog, and those who were near him heard him murmur, "Yes, I am convinced that Top knows more than we do about many things." However, the wishes of the colonists had been in a great measure realized. Chance, aided by the marvelous acuteness of their chief, had done them good service. Here they had at their disposal a vast cavern, whose extent could not be estimated in the insufficient light of the torches, but which could certainly be easily partitioned off with bricks into chambers, and arranged, if not as a house, at least as a spacious suite of rooms. The water, having left it, could not return. The place was free. But two difficulties remained: the possibility of lighting the cavern and the necessity of rendering it easier of access. The first could not be done from above, as the enormous mass of granite was over them, but, perhaps, they would be able to pierce the outer wall which faced the sea. Smith, who during the descent had kept account of the slope, and therefore of the length of the passage, believed that this part of the wall could not be very thick. If light could be thus obtained, so could entrance, as it was as easy to pierce a door as windows, and to fix a ladder on the outside. Smith communicated his ideas to his companions. "Then let us set to work," answered Pencroff. "I have my pick and will I soon make daylight in the granite." "Where shall I begin?" "Here," answered the engineer, showing the strong sailor a considerable hollow in the wall, which greatly diminished its thickness. Pencroff attacked the granite, and for half an hour, by the light of the torches, made the splinters fly about him. Then Neb took his place, and Spilett after Neb. The work continued 2 hours longer, and, when it seemed as if the wall could not be thicker than the length of the pick, at the last stroke of Spilett the implement, passing through, fell on the outside. "Hurrah forever!" cried Pencroff. The wall was but 3 feet thick. Smith looked through the opening, which was 80 feet above the ground. Before him extended the coast, the islet, and, beyond, the boundless sea. Through the hole the light entered in floods, inundating the splendid cavern and producing a magical effect. While on the left hand it measured only 30 feet in height and 100 in length, to the right it was enormous, and its vault rose to a height of more than 80 feet. In some places, granite pillars, irregularly disposed, supported the arches as in the nave of a cathedral. Resting upon a sort of lateral piers, here, sinking into elliptic arches, there, rising in ogive mouldings, losing itself in the dark bays, half seen in the shadow through the fantastic arches, ornamented by a profusion of projections which seemed like pendants, this vaulted roof afforded a picturesque blending of all the architectures, Byzantine, Roman, Gothic, that the hand of man has produced. And this was the work of nature. She alone had constructed this magic Alhambra in a granite rock. The colonists were overcome with admiration. Expecting to find but a narrow cavern, they found themselves in a sort of marvelous palace, and Neb had taken off his hat as if he had been transported into a temple. Exclamations of pleasure escaped from their lips, and the hurrahs echoed and re-echoed from the depths of the dark nave. "My friends," cried Smith, "when we shall have lighted the interior of this place, when we shall have arranged our chambers, our storerooms, our offices in the left-hand portion, we will still have this splendid cavern, which shall be our study and our museum." "And we will call it?" asked Herbert. "Granite House," answered Smith, and his companions saluted the name with their cheers. By this time the torches were nearly consumed, and as, in order to return, it was necessary to regain the summit of the plateau and to remount the corridor, it was decided to postpone until the morrow the work of arranging their new home. Before leaving, Smith leaned over the dark pit once more and listened attentively. But there was no sound from these depths save that of the water agitated by the undulations of the surge. A resinous torch was again thrown in, lighting up anew for an instant the walls of the well, but nothing suspicious was revealed. If any marine monster had been inopportunely surprised by the retreat of the waters, he had already regained the open sea by the subterranean passage which extended under the shore. Nevertheless the engineer stood motionless, listening attentively, his gaze plunged in the abyss, without speaking. Then the sailor approached him, and, touching his arm, "Mr. Smith," he said. "What is it, my friend?" responded the engineer, like one returning from the land of dreams. "The torches are nearly out." "Forward," said Smith, and the little troop left the cavern and began the ascent through the dark weir. Top walked behind, still growling in an odd way. The ascension was sufficiently laborious, and the colonists stopped for a few minutes at the upper grotto, which formed a sort of landing halfway up the long granite stairway. Then they began again to mount, and pretty soon they felt the fresh air. The drops, already evaporated, no longer shone on the walls. The light of the torches diminished, any bees went out, and they had to hasten in order to avoid having to grope their way through the profound darkness. A little before 4 o'clock, just as the torch of the sailor was burnt out, Smith and his companions emerged from the mouth of the passage. Chapter 19. Smith's plan, the front of Granite House, the rope ladder, Pencroff's ideas, the aromatic herbs, a natural warren, getting water, the view from the windows of Granite House. On the next day, May 22, the colonists proceeded to take possession of their new abode. They longed to exchange their insufficient shelter for the vast retreat in the rock, impenetrable to wind and wave. Still they did not intend altogether to abandon the Chimneys, but to make a workshop of it. Smith's first care was to ascertain exactly over what point rose the face of Granite House. He went down on the shore to the foot of the immense wall, and, as the pickaxe, which slipped from the reporter's hands, must have fallen perpendicularly, he could ascertain, by finding this pickaxe, the place where the granite had been pierced. And, in fact, when the implement was found, half buried in the sand, the hole in the rock could be seen 80 feet above it, in a straight line. Rock pigeons were already fluttering in and out by this narrow opening. They evidently thought Granite House had been discovered for their benefit. The engineer intended to divide the right portion of the cavern into several chambers opening upon an entrance corridor, and lighted by 5 windows and a door cut in the face of the rock. Pencroff agreed with him as to the window, but could not understand the use of the door, since the old weir furnished a natural staircase to Granite House. "My friend," said Smith, "if we could get to our abode by the weir, so can others. I want to block up this passage at its mouth, to seal it hermetically, and even, if necessary, to conceal the entrance by damming up the lake." "And how shall we get in?" said the sailor. "By a rope ladder from the outside," answered Smith, "which we can pull up after us." "But why take so many precautions?" said Pencroff. "So far, the animals we have found here have not been formidable, and there are certainly no natives." "Are you so sure, Pencroff?" said the engineer, looking steadily at the sailor. "Of course we shall not be perfectly sure till we have explored every part." "Yes," said Smith, "for we know as yet only a small portion. But even if there are no enemies upon the island, they may come from the outside, for this part of the Pacific is a dangerous region. We must take every precaution." So the facade of Granite House was lighted with 5 windows, and with a door opening upon their apartments and admitting plenty of light into that wonderful nave which was to serve as their principal hall-room. This facade, 80 feet above the ground, was turned to the east, and caught the first rays of the morning sun. It was protected by the slope of the rock from the piercing northeast wind. In the meantime, while the sashes of the windows were being made, the engineer meant to close the openings with thick shutters, which would keep out wind and rain, and which could be readily concealed. The first work was to hollow out these windows. But the pickaxe was at a disadvantage among these hard rocks, and Smith again had recourse to the nitroglycerin, which, used in small quantities, had the desired effect. Then the work was finished by the pick and mattock, the 5 ogive windows, the bay, the bull's-eyes, and the door, and, some days after the work was begun, the sun shone in upon the innermost recesses of Granite House. According to Smith's plan, the space had been divided into 5 compartments looking out upon the sea. Upon the right was the hall, opposite to the door from which the ladder was to hang, then a kitchen 30 feet long, a dining room 40 feet long, a sleeping room of the same size, and last a guest chamber claimed by Pencroff, and bordering on the great hall. These rooms, or rather this suite of rooms, in which they were to live, did not occupy the full depth of the cave. They opened upon a corridor which ran between them and a long storehouse, where were kept their utensils and provisions. All the products of the island, animal and vegetable, could be kept there in good condition and free from damp. They had room enough, and there was a place for everything. Moreover, the colonists still had at their disposal the little grotto above the large cavern, which would serve them as a sort of attic. This plan agreed upon, they became brickmakers again, and brought their bricks to the foot of Granite House. Until that time the colonists had had access to the cavern only by the old weir. This mode of communication compelled them first to climb up Prospect Plateau, going round by the river, to descend 200 feet through the passage, and then to ascend the same distance when they wanted to regain the plateau. This involved fatigue and loss of time. Smith resolved to begin at once the construction of a strong rope ladder, which, once drawn up after them, would render the entrance to Granite House absolutely inaccessible. This ladder was made with the greatest care, and its sides were twisted of fibers by means of a shuttle. Thus constructed, it had the strength of a cable. The rungs were made of a kind of red cedar, with light and durable branches, and the whole was put together by the practiced hand of Pencroff. Another kind of tackle was made of vegetable fiber, and a sort of derrick was set up at the door of Granite House. In this way the bricks could easily be carried to the level of Granite House, and when some thousands of them were on the spot, with abundance of lime, they began work on the interior. They easily set up the wood partitions, and in a short time the space was divided into chambers and a storehouse, according to the plan agreed upon. These labors went on quickly under the direction of the engineer, who himself wielded hammer and trowel. They worked confidently and gaily. Pencroff, whether carpenter, ropemaker, or mason, always had a joke ready, and all shared in his good humor. His confidence in the engineer was absolute. All their wants would be supplied in Smith's own time. He dreamed of canals, of quarries, of mines, of machinery, even of railroads, one day, to cover the island. The engineer let Pencroff talk. He knew how contagious is confidence, he smiled to hear him, and said nothing of his own inquietude. But in his heart he feared that no help could come from the outside. In that part of the Pacific, out of the track of ships, and at such a distance from other land that no boat could dare put out to sea, they had only themselves to rely upon. But, as the sailor said, they were far ahead of the Swiss family Robinson, for whom miracles were always being wrought. In truth they knew nature, and he who knows nature will succeed when others would lie down to die. Herbert especially distinguished himself in the work. He understood at a word and was prompt in execution. Smith grew fonder of him every day and Herbert was devoted to the engineer. Pencroff saw the growing friendship, but the honest sailor was not jealous. Neb was courage, zeal, and self-denial in person. He relied on his master as absolutely as Pencroff, but his enthusiasm was not so noisy. The sailor and he were great friends. As to Spilett, his skill and efficiency were a daily wonder to Pencroff. He was the model of a newspaper man, quick alike to understand and to perform. The ladder was put in place May 28. It was 80 feet high, and consisted of 100 rungs, and, profiting by a projection in the face of the cliff, about 40 feet up, Smith had divided it into 2 parts. This projection served as a sort of landing place for the head of the lower ladder, shortening it, and thus lessening its swing. They fastened it with a cord so that it could easily be raised to the level of Granite House. The upper ladder they fastened at top and bottom. In this way the ascent was much more easy. Besides, Smith counted upon putting up at some future time a hydraulic elevator, which would save his companions much fatigue and loss of time. The colonists rapidly accustomed themselves to the use of this ladder. The sailor, who was used to shrouds and ratlines, was their teacher. The great trouble was with Top, whose 4 feet were not intended for ladders. But Pencroff was persevering, and Top at last learned to run up and down as nimbly as his brothers of the circus. We cannot say whether the sailor was proud of this pupil, but he sometimes carried Top up on his back, and Top made no complaints. All this time, the question of provisions was not neglected. Every day Herbert and the reporter spent some hours in the chase. They hunted only through Jacama Woods, on the left of the river, for, in the absence of boat or bridge, they had not yet crossed the Mersey. The immense woody tracts which they had named the forests of the far west were entirely unexplored. This important excursion was set apart for the first 5 days of the coming spring. But Jacama Woods were not wanting in game, kangaroos and boars were plenty there, and the iron-tipped spears, the bows and arrows of the hunters did wonders. More than this, Herbert discovered, at the southwest corner of the lagoon, a natural warren, a sort of moist meadow covered with willows and aromatic herbs, which perfumed the air, such as thyme, basil, and all sorts of mint, of which rabbits are so fond. The reporter said that when the feast was spread for them it would be strange if the rabbits did not come, and the hunters explored the warren carefully. At all events, it produced an abundance of useful plants, and would give a naturalist plenty of work. Herbert gathered a quantity of plants possessing different medicinal properties: pectoral, astringent, febrifuge, antirheumatic. When Pencroff asked of what good were all this collection of herbs? "To cure us when we are sick," answered the boy. "Why should we be sick, since there are no doctors on the island?" said Pencroff, quite seriously. To this no reply could be made, but the lad went on gathering his bundle, which was warmly welcomed at Granite House, especially as he had found some mountain mint, known in North America as Oswego tea, which produces a pleasant beverage. That day the hunters, in their search, reached the site of the warren. The ground was perforated with little holes like a colander. "Burrows!" cried Herbert. "But are they inhabited? That is the question." A question which was quickly resolved. Almost immediately, hundreds of little animals, like rabbits, took to flight in every direction, with such rapidity that Top himself was distanced. But the reporter was determined not to quit the place till he had captured half a dozen of the little beasts. He wanted them now for the kitchen, domestication would come later. With a few snares laid at the mouth of the burrows, the affair would be easy, but there were no snares, nor materials for snares, so they patiently rummaged every form with their sticks, until 4 rodents were taken. They were rabbits, much like their European congeners, and commonly known as American hares. They were brought back to Granite home, and figured in that evening's meal. Delicious eating they were, and the warren bade fair to be a most valuable reserve for the colonists. On May 31, the partitions were finished, and nothing remained but to furnish the rooms, which would occupy the long days of winter. A chimney was built in the room which served as a kitchen. The construction of the stovepipe gave them a good deal of trouble. The simplest material was clay, and as they did not wish to have any outlet on the upper plateau, they pierced a hole above the kitchen window, and conducted the pipe obliquely to this hole. No doubt during an eastern gale the pipe would smoke, but the wind rarely blew from that quarter, and head cook N.E.B. was not particular. When these domestic arrangements had been made, the engineer proceeded to block up the mouth of the old weir by the lake, so as to prevent any approach from that quarter. Great square blocks were rolled to the opening, and strongly cemented together. Smith did not yet attempt to put in execution his project of damming up the waters of the lake so as to conceal this weir. He was satisfied with concealing the obstruction he had placed there by means of grass, shrubs, and thistles, which were planted in the interstices of the rocks, and which by the next spring would sprout up luxuriantly. Meanwhile he utilized the weir in conducting to their new abode a little stream of fresh water from the lake. A little drain, constructed just below its level, had the effect of supplying them with 25 or 30 gallons a day, so there was likely to be no want of water at Granite House. At last, all was finished, just in time for the tempestuous season. They closed the windows with thick shutters till Smith should have time to make glass from the sand. In the rocky projections around the windows Spilett had arranged, very artistically, plants of various kinds and long floating grasses, and thus the windows were framed picturesquely in green. The denizens of this safe and solid dwelling could but be delighted with their work. The windows opened upon a limitless horizon, shut in only by the two Mandiable Capes on the north and by Claw Cape at the south. Union Bay spread magnificently before them. They had reason enough to be satisfied, and Pencroff did not spare his praises of what he called his suite on the 5th floor. Chapter XX. The rainy season, what to wear, a seal hunt, candle making, work in the granite house, the 2 causeways. Return from a visit to the oyster bed, what Herbert found is his pocket. The winter season began in earnest with the month of June, which corresponded with December in our northern hemisphere. Showers and storms succeeded each other without an intermission, and the inmates of the granite house could appreciate the advantages of a dwelling impervious to the weather. The chimneys would indeed have proved a miserable shelter against the inclemency of the winter. They feared even lest the high tides driven by the sea wind should pour in and destroy their furnaces and their foundry. All this month of June was occupied with various labors, which left plenty of time for hunting and fishing, so that the reserve stock of food was constantly kept up. Pencroff intended, as soon as he had time, to set traps, from which he expected great results. He had made snares of ligneous fiber, and not a day passed but some rodent was captured from the warren. Neb spent all his time in smoking and salting meat. The question of clothes now came up for serious discussion. The colonists had no other garments than those which they wore when the balloon cast them on shore. These, fortunately, were warm and substantial, and by dint of extreme care, even their linen had been kept clean and whole, but everything would soon wear out, and moreover, during a vigorous winter, they would suffer severely from cold. Here Smith was fairly baffled. He had been occupied in providing for their most urgent wants, food and shelter, and the winter was upon them before the clothes problem could be solved. They must resign themselves to bear the cold with fortitude, and when the dry season returned would undertake a great hunt of the mouflons, which they had seen on Mount Franklin, and whose wool the engineer could surely make into warm thick cloth. He would think over the method. "Well, we must toast ourselves before the fire," said Pencroff. "There's plenty of firewood, no reason for sparing it. Besides," added Spilett, "Lincoln Island is not in very high latitude, and the winters are probably mild. Did you not say, Cyrus, that the 35th parallel corresponded with that of Spain in the other hemisphere?" "Yes," said the engineer, "but the winter in Spain is sometimes very cold, with snow and ice, and we may have a hard time of it. Still we are on an island, and have a good chance for more moderate weather." "Why, Mr. Smith?" said Herbert. "Because the sea, my boy, may be considered as an immense reservoir, in which the summer heat lies stored. At the coming of winter this heat is again given out, so that the neighboring regions have always a medium temperature, cooler in summer and warmer in winter." "We shall see," said Pencroff. "I am not going to bother myself about the weather. One thing is certain, the days are getting short already and the evenings long. Suppose we talk a little about candles." "Nothing is easier," said Smith. "To talk about?" asked the sailor. "To make." "And when shall we begin?" "Tomorrow, by a seal hunt." "What? To make dips?" "No, indeed, Pencroff, candles." Such was the engineer's project, which was feasible enough, as he had lime and sulphuric acid, and as the amphibia of the island would furnish the necessary fat. It was now June 4, and Pentecost Sunday, which they kept as a day of rest and thanksgiving. They were no longer miserable castaways, they were colonists. On the next day, June 5, they started for the islet. They had to choose the time of low tide to ford the channel, and all determined that, somehow or other, they must build a boat which would give them easy communication with all parts of the island, and would enable them to go up the Mersey, when they should undertake that grand exploration of the southwestern district which they had reserved for the first good weather. Seals were numerous, and the hunters, armed with their iron-spiked spears, easily killed half a dozen of them, which Neb and Pencroff skinned. Only the hides and fat were carried back to Granite House, the former to be made into shoes. The result of the hunt was about 300 pounds of fat, every pound of which could be used in making candles. The operation was simple enough, and the product, if not the best of its kind, was all they needed. Had Smith had at his disposition nothing but sulfuric acid, he could, by heating this acid with neutral fats, such as the fat of the seal, separate the glycerin, which again could be resolved, by means of boiling water, into oline, margarine, and stearin. But, to simplify the operation, he preferred to saponify the fat by lime. He thus obtained a calcareous soap, easily decomposed by sulfuric acid, which precipitated the lime as a sulfate, and freed the fatty acids. The first of these three acids, oline, margarine, and stearin, was a liquid which he expelled by pressure. The other two formed the raw material of the candles. In 24 hours the work was done. Wicks were made, after some unsuccessful attempts, from vegetable fiber, and were steeped in the liquefied compound. They were real stearin candles, made by hand, white and smooth. During all this month work was going on inside their new abode. There was plenty of carpenter's work to do. They improved and completed their tools, which were very rudimentary. Scissors were made, among other things, so that they were able to cut their hair, and, if not actually to shave their beards, at least to trim them to their liking. Herbert had no beard, and Neb none to speak of, but the others found ample employment for the scissors. They had infinite trouble in making a handsaw, but at last succeeded in shaping an instrument which would cut wood by a rigorous application. Then they made tables, chairs and cupboards to furnish the principal rooms, and the frames of beds whose only bedding was mattresses of rack grass. The kitchen, with its shelves, on which lay the terracotta utensils, its brick furnace, and its washing stone, looked very comfortable, and Neb cooked with the gravity of a chemist in his laboratory. But joiner's work had to give place to carpentry. The new weir created by the explosion rendered necessary the construction of two causeways, one upon Prospect Plateau, the other on the shore itself. Now the plateau and the coast were transversely cut by a watercourse which the colonists had to cross whenever they wished to reach the northern part of the island. To avoid this they had to make a considerable detour, and to walk westward as far as the sources of Red Creek. Their best plan therefore was to build two causeways, one on the plateau and one on the shore, 20 to 25 feet long, simply constructed of trees squared by the axe. This was the work of some days. When these bridges had been built, Neb and Pencroff profited by them to go to the oyster bed which had been discovered off the down. They dragged after them a sort of rough cart which had taken the place of the inconvenient hurdle, and they brought back several thousand oysters, which were readily acclimated among the rocks, and formed a natural preserve at the mouth of the Mersey. They were excellent of their kind, and formed an almost daily article of diet. In fact, Lincoln Island, though the colonists had explored but a small portion of it, already supplied nearly all their wants, while it seemed likely that a minute exploration of the western forests would reveal a world of new treasures. Only one privation still distressed the colonists. Azotic food they had in plenty, and the vegetables which corrected it, from the ligneous roots of the dragon trees, submitted to fermentation, they obtained a sort of acidulated beer. They had even made sugar, without sugarcane or beetroot, by collecting the juice which distills from the Acer saccharinum, a sort of maple which flourishes in all parts of the temperate zone, and which abounded on the island. They made a very pleasant tea from the plant brought from the warren, and, finally, they had plenty of salt, the only mineral component necessary to food. But bread was still to seek. Perhaps, at some future time, they would have been able to replace this aliment by some equivalent, sago flour, or the breadfruit tree, which they might possibly have discovered in the woods of the southwest, but so far they had not met with them. Just at this time a little incident occurred which brought about what Smith, with all his ingenuity, could not have achieved. One rainy day the colonists were together in the large hall of Granite House, when Herbert suddenly cried, "See, Mr. Smith, a grain of corn." And he showed his companions a single gram which had got into the lining of his waistcoat through a hole in his pocket. Pencroff had given him some ringdoves in Richmond, and in feeding them one of the grains had remained in his pocket. "A grain of corn," said the engineer, quickly. "Yes, sir, but only one." "That's a wonderful help," said Pencroff, laughing. "The bread that grain will make will never choke us." Herbert was about to throw away the grain, when Cyrus Smith took it, examined it, found that it was in good condition, and said quietly to the sailor, Pencroff, do you know how many ears of corn will spring from one grain? 1, I suppose, said the sailor, surprised at the question. 10, Pencroff. And how many grains are there to an ear? Faith, I don't know. 80 on an average, said Smith. So then, if we plant this grain, we shall get from it a harvest of 800 grains, from them in the second year 640,000, in the third, 512 million, in the fourth, more than 400 billion. That is the proportion. His companions listened in silence. The figures stupefied them. Yes, my friend, resumed the engineer. Such is the increase of nature. And what is even this multiplication of a grain of corn whose ears have only 800 grains, compared with the poppy plant, which has 32,000 seeds, or the tobacco plant, which has 360,000? In a few years, but for the numerous enemies which destroy them, these plants would cover the earth. And now, Pencroff, he resumed, do you know how many bushels there are in 400 billion grains? No, answered the sailor, I only know that I am an idiot. Well, there will be more than 3 million, at 130,000 the bushel. 3 millions! Cried Pencroff. 3 millions! In 4 years? Yes, said Smith, and even in 2, if, as I hope, we can get 2 harvests a year in this latitude. Pencroff answered with a tremendous hurrah. So, Herbert, added the engineer, your discovery is of immense importance. Remember, my friends, that everything may be of use to us in our present situation. Indeed, Mr. Smith, I will remember it, said Pencroff, and if ever I find one of those grains of tobacco which increase 360,000 times, I'll take care not to throw it away. And now what must we do? We must plant this grain, said Herbert. Yes, added Spilett, and with the greatest care, for upon it depend our future harvests. Provided that it grows, said the sailor. It will grow, answered Smith. It was now the 20th of June, a good time for planting the precious grain. They thought at first of planting it in a pot, but upon consideration, they determined to trust it frankly to the soil. The same day it was planted, with the greatest precaution. The weather clearing a little, they walked up to the plateau above Granite House, and chose there a spot well sheltered from the wind, and exposed to the midday fervor of the sun. This spot was cleared, weeded, and even dug, so as to destroy insects and worms. It was covered with a layer of fresh earth, enriched with a little lime, a palisade was built around it, and then the grain was covered up in its moist bed. They seemed to be laying the cornerstone of an edifice. Pencroff was reminded of the extreme care with which they had lighted their only match, but this was a more serious matter. The castaways could always have succeeded in obtaining fire by some means or other, but no earthly power could restore that grain of corn, if, by ill fortune, it should perish.